I think I would start us off maybe with what kind of appears in the space and appears in your films in multiple forms, which are the four classical elements: air, water, fire, and earth. And I think, these, I mean, throughout the film, you use them in multiple ways, but they also kind of form a site or act as a tool from which you can kind of speculate or pose your what-if experiments. And somehow through those elements, you kind of traverse different geographies and scales and spaces, but you also are able to move between different histories and times. And I think even more so, what appears first as these distinct four elements, somehow also the distinction between them is slowly undermined. Like water evaporates into something else, air condenses into something else. So yeah, I'm curious, or maybe you can say a little bit more how these elements kind of allow you, or the usage of these elements allow you to push against like notions of space and time that somehow we've all agreed to, and also the ways in which you're able to use these elements to kind of connect phenomena that appear to be disparate or that appear to be somehow independent from one another.
You want me to start? Yes, it is. Thank you for the somatic workshop, and thank you. I guess let's go back to 2016 and the film that Denise and I first collaborated on is called Serpent Rain. The beginning of that project, we asked the question whether it's possible or can we make a film without time. Obviously you can't, because there's a timeline. It's like the first step to making a film, knowing how long it's going to be and how to edit on the timeline. As we kind of researched and developed the project and developed the film, we ended the film. It's the last question, last text in Serpent Rain, which you can see in the cloud chamber back there. We ended up with the question, what becomes of the human if expressed by the elements? And we didn't know at the time, but this question we have consistently returned to. We find, like, we made another film not thinking about it, and it came up, and it keeps coming up. And I think as a way, like, I mean, I don't think that's answering your question so much, but it's introducing or giving some of the background of how we came to start thinking with the elements.
Is it on? Yes. Thanks, Dalia, for the body work exercise, and thank you for doing this conversation with us. The reason I asked Arjuna to go first, because I knew he had that answer that we gave somebody else, so I knew he was ready to go. So that gave me time to think, okay, how do we go about answering this time around? Yeah, I think many things, but I think just to highlight one aspect of your question, which is something you mentioned and you got from how we, the elements work in the works, is that they really allow us to describe things as not necessarily connected, and then to connect things that appear not to be connected, precisely because they are not different things. They are also reference to different stages or phases or modality of presentation of things. So as you said, from air to water, water to fire, fire to earth, you have the same things, the same basic elements, just shifting, changing. So it's a different way of also talking about change, right? Or more specifically, we talk about transformation of the same basic thing.
And in following the movements of the elemental beyond the human also, I feel like you trace out a conception of violence that is no longer reducible to a human subject that is experiencing this violence. And it seems like these are like very, that's a kind of core question that your work also seeks to address, is like the ways in which the human is both, is also an obstacle to, or obstructs the view onto broader worldly forms of sensibilities and modalities of violence. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's also a question of what is considered a human and what has been excluded from the category of the human. And I mean, I think like what has been excluded is usually the natural world, the environment, but also certain types of people get categorized as not human. And so that violence that you talk of that goes beyond the human has been done in a way that has been kind of authorized and accepted, normalized because of this distinction.
Yes, it's one way that we can describe the trajectory of the human, like this imagined trajectory of humanity, is in this progressive movement away from violence, right? Because at the beginning, there was the state of nature where everybody is violent, and then the rational humans in particular, those move away from violence, they have law, state, etc. But one thing we never attend to is how that story places violence everywhere. Like the story that tells us what makes the human unique is a story that actually places violence at the core of the human and the core of everything else, but then the human is able to move away from that. But when we look at the history of that kind of thought, I mean, if we look at the time, since when this particular kind of thought has ruled, like the last, 400 years, we find that increasingly our lives have been defined by precisely violence that goes unchecked and to which we end up being used, as long as it's happening to somebody else or somewhere else. So the idea is precisely to erase that intrinsic distinction.
And I think in that kind of specific or more, this very specific definition of violence that you kind of try to unfold in the film, which I think happens in this film, but also in your previous work and in the broader sense of your practices, there's like kind of a clear point that you're making about the ways in which like violence can operate or does operate not only through like physical force, or not only through these kind of or like across various matters and materialities. So once you kind of make a portrait of extraction, which is a kind of central focus of this film, one cannot detach that from abstraction, or one cannot detach that from the question of abstraction. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this, but also because I think then what becomes key is how do we intervene on that level of abstraction? How can we kind of poke at the very modalities that are inherent to the ways in which violence operates? I think it's not a question we answer like immediately, but we can think about.
I think this obviously is the question that we pursue in the films, and the beauty of doing that in that form in the film is that in a way it reproduces. I mean, it's basically defined by that which is at the core of that violence and of abstraction, which is visuality and the distance, right? That it's there, it's being presented there. And that allows for several things. One of them is that, that distance allows for that what's happening, to assume that what's happening there, it's not affecting me. But then the ways in which the sound works in the films, and that's something that Arjuna is amazing in making work beautifully, that already it comes to you right here, right? So while that image is out there, actually, as you're watching it, it's coming to you very close. It's being touched by the sound and touched by the image. So that's one of the ways in which we attempt to hail, to call on, to cultivate a sensibility that's not premised on violence or on the separations that allow us violence to work so well for capital.
Yeah, just thinking a bit about this kind of the violences that are abstracted or that we don't see, and just to try and give an example of, of all the amount of time, and we sort of know this, like the amount of time we spend on social media, the amount of time and how much energy we put and attention we put into that. And that is a kind of abstract violence. We don't really see it, but we end up exhausted at the end. We all know it, but it's not something that is so explicitly, I mean, it is sort of in conversation it is, but it's not something you point to or measure really. And I think that's just, when you look at the lithium, you have the kind of very material side of violence and a certain kind of abstraction in terms of distance, and then you have your smartphone, and the other side of abstraction and extraction. Yeah.
And one of the central ways in which like this play of distance and proximity, of like abstraction and materiality plays out in the film is through a historical parallel, but also a structural equivalence between neoliberalism and fascism in Chile specifically, but of course also beyond that. And I'd be curious to hear more about how or why these speculative moves that you also make felt necessary to emphasize, the shared characteristics of neoliberalism and fascism rather than treating them as like historically separate regimes. Yeah.
I think there's quite a few different ways we can go into the relationship between fascism and neoliberalism. But I think maybe sticking with the kind of example of the smartphone and kind of attention economy and how neoliberalism works is it sort of feeds off of emotions, affect. I mean, the different definitions of neoliberalism, but specifically talking about the kind of affective economy, the way it capitalizes on your soul, on your expression, on your creativity, all of these kind of subjective, non-material parts. We can think of, the more inflammatory comments you make on social media, the more hits you get. And I think fascism works in a very similar way of capitalizing on very strong feelings, mythical or metaphysical feelings, and it cultivates them and directs them to a certain purpose. So I think neoliberalism can certainly exploit fascistic feelings and put it to extraction, put it to work.
And that may, I shouldn't say may, I think that has a lot to do also with the fact that the economic theories that give us neoliberalism on the one hand and fascism, they kind of emerged around the same time at the beginning of the 20th century. And if I'm not mistaken, Vienna has a lot to do with it, with that moment. So I think both of them are unfoldings of a particular mode of thinking, the particular political mode of political organization that consolidates starts to consolidate at the beginning of the 20th century. I think at first it wouldn't really give you political violence, right? Because you have this hyper focus on the individual. But then at the same time it does, because this hyper individualized modes of interaction, they have to presume some kind of connection, right? That connection that, I've been citing Mussolini too much lately, but it's because I just wrote a paper about fascism in Brazil. But that kind of connection that Mussolini says that is between the state and between the state and the person, in particular that the role that the state has to play in terms of security. That is a hyper connection that happens, it's activated in discourse in the early 20th century that now it seems to be. We live it, right? And then at the same time, we find that this more and more that what we face is precisely the more violent side of the state, not only in, obviously authoritarian contexts, like to use the term, but also in others where you see functioning democracies like Brazil, for instance. But you see the state through the police, not necessarily through the army or as a dictatorship. So they are not separate, the point is, right? And now both of them are coming, to our face in ways that we in the past 20 years, we did not think it would be this way. Yeah.
And I think just to add to that, I think just to contextualize a little bit, I think this is a big reason why we are so interested in Chile and the history of the dictatorship there as a kind of early warning sign for the partnership between fascism and neoliberalism. I mean, Pinochet dictatorship wasn't so fascist, wasn't technically a fascistic state, but it certainly carried many of its core principles and certainly its tactics of violence, and it was nominally the beginning or one of the beginning points of neoliberalism. So.
And speaking of the the relation between the state and the individual. Do you see like a parallel between, because you just mentioned Mussolini, and I'm curious to hear more about what that specifically means and about the resonances perhaps in Chile between like Mussolini's vision and Chile's reality at the time. If that is like not,
it's a complicated question.
Okay, so that's a difficult question. So Hannah Arendt has this short piece. I forgot the title now. It's a short article in which she makes a distinction between authoritarianism, dictatorship, and totalitarianism. And she's obviously making a case for the, how totalitarianism is something very specific, and that is something that could only become possible from the 19th century. But yet, which gives us, Nazism and fascism in general. But yet, she had to make that distinction precisely because of the lack of difference between the three of them in terms of being referring to, modes of governance through total violence. So, yeah.
Yeah, that it's precisely through violence that one can read the similarities, and that it's violence that kind of allows for those equivalences. And it's also maybe violence that masks the equivalences at the same time. Yeah.
I guess just to add, sort of one of the logic or illogic of neoliberalism is to be able to hold contradictions, not in a dialectical way, just to have absurd and paradoxical contradictions at the same time. So it has this mechanism in which the fascism was, antagonistic to capitalism, and it has no problem in its illogic holding them at the same time and exploiting both of them or developing them in ways that, sometimes called mutant neoliberalism.
And you would say that it can hold these antagonisms, but kind of purposely masks their similarity. Like it can hold these antagonisms, but really kind of performs that they are very far from, or like that one is the flip side of the other or something, rather than, that they come together or something.
Yeah, they don't come together. I mean, I think the example of the refugee and migration, and thinking about how on one level both neoliberalism and fascism, reject the refugee. Neoliberalism, like, they both, determine the refugee is not welcome. But at the same time, what the pandemic showed was that migrant labor or very cheap labor from refugees was actually a necessity. And so the laws, even in countries with a strong sense of nationalism, they relaxed their, what is the word, where they deport. They relaxed their deportation laws just for this period of the pandemic to bring the labor in. So it shows that there's a one level where the refugees are not welcome, and then on a kind of more economic level, then they are welcome only for their cheap labor. And this paradox is used to maintain sub minimum wage levels of wages. So.
Yeah, I think we can think of it in terms of the work that the state does for capital, and that work will obviously close and open borders depending on what's necessary. And then at the same time, you make selections in terms of who can be let in at which time, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we find that which allows us to live more or less well in these, neoliberal paradises are precisely the devastations, ecological and human devastations happening in the sites of extraction, right, and the sites of expropriation of labor, from where people are fleeing anyway. So if we look, if instead of just focusing on what's happening in one country or what's happening in one region or in one continent, if we look at these operations at the same time, and also for us, we have this vantage point, which is we are thinking about this after the 90s, after we saw the whole process of setting up the WTO and really connecting everything and dismantling all the rights, labor rights everywhere. So now when we look back out, okay, so, how is it that, we can have those paradoxes? We don't have paradoxes. We actually have, different operations, which when you look at them at once, we see that, yeah, well, the corporations are doing very well, thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to connect also to the kind of elements in that regard. I mean that's precisely what the kind of use of the elemental or the gesture of the elemental can point to. Know that like what kind of a cloud can carry are these operations that kind of expand or extend in multiple places and kind of condense into
totally. The elemental approach allows us to think of, to zoom very, very close to the very material, to the actual lithium, to the batteries in the front, and then to also zoom out and have a look at what's happening in Chile and what's happening here in Vienna at the same time, and see what those relations are. And they're not necessarily direct causal relations. They're, it can be transformative relations, as in relations across phase transition as opposed to causal.
Yeah, by kind of showing those relations, also the concept of a relation is a bit challenged, or like the concept of a causal relation is a bit kind of put to the test. Yeah.
Hopefully exploded as the only way of explaining, of accounting for what's happening. And also those separations, like looking at the lithium there and thinking, on the one hand, our, all the possible solutions to global warming or to reducing emissions, whatever, will come through that thing, right? But then at the same time, all the bad mental health effects of this lifestyle we have also can be taken care by through that thing. And then there is that is having an effect on, obviously, on the Andes, and will have an impact on the climate precisely because of all the water that they are using in order to, make our future possible. So, and that's one, and it is an element, right, in the chemical sense of it.
In the film, we have this phrase that we talked about before, about everyone carries a small piece of Chile in them, in their pocket. And I think this is a good example of elemental thinking, or elemental way of a method, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And in thinking about, a lot of the figures that you use, they kind of share these blurry boundaries, perhaps, a ghost ship or a cloud, and, I think to me this speaks to, a lot of thought going into the ways in which to figure violence, and to figure violence in a way so as to not reproduce its mechanisms on, a symbolic field of intervention. And so, I'd be curious to hear more about, the stakes here, but also, sometimes I have this feeling that there's sometimes I have this impetus to, I feel like that in order to address violence, you kind of want to address it with maximum accuracy, right? You want to prove that it is out there, right? Like the image of the lithium mine proving something. And yet at the same time, it also seems necessary to remain on a certain level of opacity and vagueness at moments. So, yeah.
Well, we have had so many conversations. Every film's like, oh no, and now how much of it are we going to show? And it's true, because if you are thinking, if we are commenting on violence, we can't pretend that it's not there. But the invitation, the what if question that is also always in the films, has to do with the fact that, yes, we begin that way with the image of a cop beating up a black person in Serpent Rain, or the image of folks on the boat in Four Waters. But then we go on from there, but that doesn't have to be that way. So what if we could, start our thinking from somewhere else, denaturalizing it, de-individualizing it, de-identifying that with particular persons and places. So the blurriness is part of the commentary.
Yeah, I think also I think you're exactly right that there is both precision in handling some of these historical and contemporary moments or accounts of violence. I think it's necessary to be very careful and not necessarily precise, but very careful. And we have endless discussions about those. And then at the same time, thinking how to also, at the same time, not be precise and not what you were saying is symbolic violence or methodological violence of using precision and objectivity and rationality as a kind of scientific way to critique these violence. I don't know. It is a bit of a juggle of doing both, and I wanted to give an example of this in action. And when we were discussing the film before we started shooting, we were talking about ghosts, both as a kind of critical device, but also, what happens when you experience a ghost, if you experience a ghost, these kind of conversations. And one of the things that came up was either a temperature dropping or the hair on the back of your neck standing on end. Whether or not that's a ghost that's another question. But these kind of sensory or extrasensory experiences, like we did in this workshop about expanding our periphery vision, there's a kind of degree of attuning or sensitizing that happens, and maybe the presence of a ghost makes the hair on the back of your neck or arms stand on end. There was a challenge in the film to try and recreate the experience of chills or of having hair stand, and whether or not that's successful or not, that's a kind of an approach that we were going for.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, like, that tension that you describe, I think is definitely kind of sensorially captured also just as an audience. And I think one is kind of, at least me, I'm kind of left on the edge of my seat of like, can we give it a name? Can we give it a face kind of this violence? But also maybe that's precisely that tension that kind of gives us space to also, think actually how the mechanisms of violence go much deeper than a name or a face. And I mean, names and faces appear, but in varied ways, I would say.
But also, a lot of the violence, we say lithium is for narcissism. A lot of the violence is self-inflicted. Definitely. So to give it a name and a face is, I mean, sure, it's a problem,
Maybe because Sam already kind of brought up these figures that appear, and I think a lot of your work kind of works through this figuration, or the ghost, the cloud, the feathers. There are these various figures that appear. And do you kind of see those as like congealments of history or of histories of violence, or are they also kind of, methods of or sites of countering it? Are they, what do they open up, kind of?
I think they work as both, as figures. In a way, they are compositions that, in Benjamin's way, like they gather something, they bring it together in high focus, high depth, and then, but just as to, dissolve it. So is it a method? Maybe that's, I don't know. But they do that work. That's how I see it.
It's definitely a poetics. I like this as a better word than methods. And in the sense that it's clear and not clear. I mean, I don't want to talk in paradoxes, but so much. But these figures, I find them useful in thinking and representing abstractions and certain complex, like this figure of everyone carrying a small piece of chili in them. It's a way to really begin to grasp on a bodily or at least semi-intimate level what's going on geopolitically and globally or historically.
And this also then leads towards the end of the film. It leads to this, this proposition for mineral solidarity. And we already brought it up earlier in the conversation, but we'd just like to hear more about it because it also seems to invoke a certain, political practice, but also a political imaginary that you have previously loosely tied to the Zapatistas as an example of that. But I'd be curious to just hear more about mineral solidarity. Yeah,
I'm gonna go first. So we just finished this film and we're starting to have conversations and interviews and get feedback. And it's curious, at least three out of four, the mineral solidarity as a question, as a curiosity has come up. And I think that shows there's a real hunger for or real interest in political alternatives or questions of solidarity, how to do solidarity, what is solidarity in this moment, I don't think we have the answer. I think mineral solidarity is one of these poetic phrases. I think there are certain associations. One of them is, as we discussed and as we say in the film, what if the residues of Marxists and slaves that were thrown from Pinochet's helicopters, what if they, appear in the clouds, and maybe that's a form of mineral solidarity, or how the body parts in the unmarked graves merge with each other and become indistinct and merge with the minerals of the deserts, and how that may get taken up in the lithium extraction, and then those minerals reappear again in our phones. I think these are ways of thinking of mineral solidarity or kind of planetary solidarity.
So when we were working on the on the text, we had a question about the title. So Arjuna said mineral solidarity, and I said, but could be elemental sociality, right? And then, of course, like the title of the film, that is not about choosing one of them, but actually the fact that both are working through the film, they're guiding, and then at the same time being expressed through the film. And elemental sociality would be precisely that which would begin without separation, right? Without treating the elements as different things, but actually as appearances of that those things that make up everything, which are the elementary particles. So I would like to say that mineral solidarity in the meantime, until we can, our existence is based on ontology and metaphysics, that it's not that of the line, not that of separation. Mineral solidarity has to do with the work that must be done, right? Before as we become something else differently.
I think also elemental sociality is kind of what all the films, everything we're doing is sort of working towards elemental sociality, as how we started the conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe I just would go back to the ghost for a second. I think the ghost, of course, is kind of somehow your way of thinking between the dead and the living, but also it kind of proposes another conception of history, or like that this kind of return or recurrency of history. But then somehow in your work, I kind of read that you're actually not intervening in the place of history. Like that's not the site in which you want to kind of think, or that's not where you're engaging. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would love to also kind of maybe think about the question of history there.
Yes, I would say that we are intervening at the place where something like history comes up as a meaning that makes sense, in the ways we go about things. At the site, which is everywhere, but it's also in particular ways, in places where time is crucial, and because time is crucial, then several things are not taken into account when we try to make sense of how we live now, such as the fact that the lithium is everywhere, and also still in Chile, even if it is in the battery on my phone. So, and that's where the elemental is pointing to, and is an invitation to maybe begin to think from elsewhere, and yeah.
And following up on Lama's question on history, I think another pillar is of course science, and in particular natural sciences. And also back there in the other room, there's also an interview on display, I think, of an early stage of your research where you're talking with a climate scientist. And, important as, ideas of ecology and environmentality seem to be to your work, it's also, you appropriate them in a way that, also works against them in a sense. So like there is both, the need to engage with these sciences, but then there's also a broader philosophical point of like needing to also work against the scientific worldview. And so how do you, you know, work through this tension? Yeah.
I think when we interview scientists, we tend to find one of two kinds. I don't want to reduce all scientists and their personalities to one of two kinds.
As we do it.
But some are very poetic and imaginative, and some are not. And I think it depends on their research. I think
Most are not.
I think many need not to be, because they're need to be very precise and very focused. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. And some are open to poetic, speculative, and imaginative thinking. And I think the ones that we tend to show are the ones with the more poetic orientation. I think you're exactly right. I think we have to be very suspicious of science and its history and what rationality and objectivity and observation has introduced into, you know, the way we are in the world. But also there are so many things happening in science which itself works against this long tradition. And most scientists are fully aware of that. It's a sort of science in a general sense is problematic. Individual scientists tend to, not all of them, some subscribe very strongly. And I think we have this geologist in Four Waters who refused to think that there was some connection between human scale time and geological time. And this was funny for us, I don't know. And yeah, this is a moment of rigidity, whereas I think both Hong Bin Yu and Constanza are very open, and I think their research is guided by, you know, quite almost whimsical questions, but then it's grounded in very hard science and technology.
Yeah, so particle physics, quantum theory plays a huge role in the thinking here, but primarily because of their failure, right? Primarily because of how, in spite of the fact that they give us all kinds of things that many of them we don't want, they can't say anything with certainty about nothing that actually constitutes everything that exists. So, and that's amazing. I love it, so on that, and then on the other hand, there is also the fact that Arjuna has this amazing ability of getting the scientists to say things they would not say, but making the connections. Like you say that, you show this, you show that. Then I could say that, and they like no.
Yeah, it's the exercise of like drawing like the wrong conclusions also, which I think is kind of productive.
But also exploring, right, what they're saying, the implications of what they're finding. But they of course will stop short of, you know, how useful it is then to turn it into, you know, a weapon or an electronic gadget of, you know, of sorts.
This disclaimer, in principle, usually comes up at a certain point.
Yeah. Maybe I think it's a kind of good moment to invite people if they have questions. I can kind of moderate if people want to, yeah, ask something or also maybe comment. Yeah.
I have two questions, and you choose whichever feels more interesting or relevant. The first is that when I was introduced to both of your work through text before seeing any film material. And when I saw this film, my first kind of unreflected instinctive reaction was, it's very beautiful. And then I was so surprised that it was beautiful. I was really not expecting it to be beautiful. So, no, but not in the, no, but in the sense of a certain concept of beauty that I was not expecting to find based on what I had read from your critical perspectives that in your writing. And I wanted to maybe talk about the notion of beauty and how you relate it to questions of distance and visuality. That's one question, if you care about the notion of beauty. The other is to go back to what Arjuna said in the very beginning, that you both work with text, you both work with film, and they're both linear, time inscribed, both in their production and in their reception, various, like turn the page one after the other. And in them, you invent all of these ways of countering linear teleological time, and I would really be curious to learn more about how you work from within these media on time.
Thank you for saying that the film is beautiful. And I was looking at the lithium like, it is beautiful. That's And I think that also answers your second question, right? How do you break through certain assumptions, not only in regards to time to succession, like time that goes, but also assumptions about things being separate, and then one thing being having an identity, meaning being that thing all the time. I think we do that both in the films, and then obviously I try to do it more explicitly in writing by violating some, not the fundamental rules, because we kind of Virgo people here, so we follow them rules, but by violating the second moment of what's expected to be done with that. I'll let Arjuna.
Yeah, so the beauty question, I think when I studied with Alan Sekula and this kind of generation of Marxist artists where beauty was very much forbidden. And I think they're republishing anti-aesthetic Hal Foster's kind of book on this thing. And I think like for a long time on the left of beauty was held with suspicion because it's a spectacle and it comes from Hollywood. And I think, yeah, in a sense that's definitely true, but it also to kind of wholesale disregard that is to lose out on qualities. I mean, beauty is certainly, but like sensual qualities and intimate qualities, these kind of things, or even seductive qualities, I think they can be used in a way that isn't spectacle or so much spectacle. And we can also take it back to questions of the sublime. But yeah, I think seeing that this kind of anti-aesthetic or this position on the left that beauty is wholesale bad or capitalist or Hollywood or whatever, I think, yeah, you lose some nuance there.
And that is another way of answering your question, my answering your question. And I think I have said that before, that Soot Breath, initially when I was watching it, after it was done, and at some point, maybe 5 to 10 minutes into the film, I would just feel like I was going to cry. And I was going to cry like because of the beauty, but the pain that arrives at that moment. And I think that is crucial in terms of what I don't know if we said it before, of cultivating a certain sensibility. So there is a way in which, Immanuel Kant is writing something about the aesthetic that we don't want to go so much, we don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but that is something in the ways in which, in the movement of bringing in with that that touches you. The beautiful is supposed to be that which touches you inside. So he said only touches you in your rational mind, and we know that touches you in all different ways. So if we can get, when you get something to touch and you sense it in full body, not only the mind's apparatus, I think that's what that does. That we don't accomplish in discourse, in writing, in poetry, yes. But so that kind of sensibility we've been, playing with, inviting, hoping for, needs that horrible thing, beautiful, right?
Are there further questions? Or comments? Maybe I can just add to the beauty question. I think it's a really kind of strong point also, because a lot of times, as I think you were trying to say, Arjuna, there is a kind of accusation of aestheticizing sides of violence, or giving beauty to things that that don't deserve it, or maybe that's one way to put it. And I don't know if that's a question as much as it is kind of a follow-up comment, but there is kind of an insistence in your work that aesthetics or the ground of aesthetics is still worth being in, or is still worth rethinking how to be in. Yeah, if that
Maybe, I think we talked about it in the conversation with Andrea yesterday, the day before. I don't remember when it was, but and that's precisely the point. If violence is so effective, precisely because it goes without saying, it goes without thinking. Precisely because we have a sensibility that just takes it, accepts it as the way of things. So if we are to undo it, we do need criticality. We do need to do the work with the tools we have, the critical work with the tools we have, and we need to invent more tools to do that critical work. But I think we also have to go there. We have to shift at that level, and and that's, I think, one of the limits. And the left is changing lately. I have been talking to some people who are all moving towards the arts. It's like, oh yeah, okay, welcome. just don't bastardize it. But anyway.
I'm just remembering this Hal Foster text, and I think he cites Walter Benjamin a lot, and Walter Benjamin talks about fascism as an aestheticization of politics and violence. And I think that's all totally right, but I think like this aestheticization, or this kind of the cultivation and use and exploitation of feeling and aesthetics in the sense of feeling, is a very significant, this is what we said with Andrea the other day, is a significant part of both fascism and neoliberalism, also where we sort of started this conversation. So I think there is a very big, you do need to fight and protest and be in the Atacama Desert and stopping water extraction. I think that's one, political front. I think another one is this kind of question of cultivated feelings. What kind of feelings and emotions and subjectivity is being directed to neoliberal extraction or to fascistic violent ends or fascistic organizing? And yeah, I think that's one of the fronts that we definitely choose to spend a lot of our time focus on, as well as doing the critical analysis and the historical, consideration.
Well, and that statement by Thatcher, right? That, scary as it is also very true. So we got to fight them there too. You can repeat it.
So I say in the film, and it's a quote from Margaret Thatcher from 1981 that she wrote in the Times newspaper, and she says, "Economics is the method; the object is to change the soul." And so this is a metaphysical question. It's an aesthetic question. It's a question of time, futurity, and yeah, I think this film in particular, but all of our films, locate that as one of the fronts or one of the places to intervene very strongly on. And I think beauty is just one of those tools that help us work at that place.
The other one is standardizes on it.
It's
Tenderness.
The previous film we dedicated to tenderness.
Any final questions so that we don't end on Thatcher? Yes.
There was tenderness. But no, but there's questions.
what about the music? This was the question. Yeah.
There's a lot to say. I think early on we were thinking about soul music. Following on the last film was very much about the blues. There's always a kind of research that happens at the level of music, and we were thinking a lot about soul music. And I don't think we've finished the thinking around soul music. But one of the things that's interesting is its relationship to endings. A lot of soul music songs, they don't have any endings. And there's, to be a little more nuanced about it, there's like James Brown, who has this performance where he falls down and stands up and falls down and stands up. And I think this comes from a kind of Christian Reverend James Brown comes from a kind of Christian tradition of being resurrected. And even so, there's a kind of never-endingness to it. Then there's another tradition which comes more from the blues, which comes from the Choctaw people around Mississippi. And this is a type of music that has no beginning or end. It just lasts as long as people are willing to dance to it. And this carries into soul music. And on a lot of the albums that was released, the songs, they never end. So they just sort of fade out because of the length of the tape. And in performances, there's like many, many encores. And I think this quality of not having an ending and not really having a beginning is something that we say very much in the film. And then the last caption refers to the way soul music doesn't actually end.
I think there was another question there.
Share a little bit about how you collaborate, if you want to, and maybe also if it changed over the years, how it changed.
Well, not over. That's a good question. Okay, so of course it has changed over the years, because when we were in Bergen editing Serpent Rain, and we had to put words in the thing, and Arjuna said, we can only have 17 characters. And I'm like, I can't do this. I can't say anything with less than, 1,200 words. So one thing changed. I learned a lot about exactly about images and about this particular kind of composition. But in fact, I think the films depends on the films, right? I mean, with the Sweet Breath, we spent quite a bit of time together, like mapping the whole thing, and we had a script, right? That was actually the final script, but For Waters wasn't so much. So yeah, we can.
Yeah, different for each film, and it changes. I don't think we have a set methodology. It also, like during the pandemic, it was a different way of working, whether we're traveling and meeting or doing it remotely. It's also quite intuitive, and I think we've been doing it for long enough that we sort of know each other's decisions and each other's feedback. Yeah.
So it usually involves a coffee shop somewhere in Paris, or I don't know. My living room, and my dog Zeka also has been part of it lately.
I think we try. I mean, there's always different levels of assumed knowledge that people bring, and depending on the context, we try to respond to the context. I think in the Q&As, that's one way, one approach. But in the films, we hope very much that they work on many different levels. Whether you're like deep into philosophy and know some of these references, whether you're a history buff and know the history of Chile, or whether none of these topics that you may not have any knowledge about, we still want a visceral and sensorial experience, an experience that moves you, and that maybe you're left with a sense that things aren't quite right or aren't quite as they should be out in the world. And I think that we hope for kind of something shifting, and that I don't think that something shifting is dependent on having the full range of knowledge or even a little bit. But it's something that it's to always find the balance and play with it with each film.
So you mentioned like maybe we have a text in which we explain everything with more detail. No, we don't. Actually, if we were to write anything that comes up like the films, it would take, I don't know, millions and millions of words, and we would not be able to do that. So the films are about, in this film, is about all that we are talking about, and then so much more, and precise. And what's more important about the film is that which we cannot talk about, but that comes out, as you, that which makes you cry or makes you say, oh yes, oh yeah, I know that, or whatever reaction, especially those that come without words, because that's where the film does what it's supposed to do.
It's actually really difficult to talk about the films, and it's a funny expectation because we do a lot of Q&As, but it's also like the work is there, and it's hard to explain that.
Yeah, it's kind of more setting the frame around which the film happens, but then the film happens also. Yeah. Any more questions? Maybe we kind of close it on that also as an invitation to watch the film. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Denise and Arjuna. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.